Hey, it's me, Geno Samuel, coming at you with a very interesting video, hopefully. Some people have requested that I kind of make up a ranking of my own albums, which I think was a kind of a lofty idea, but also kind of interesting. I think it might be kind of useful for myself to self-reflect on what I've done so far, and maybe I can incite some knowledge and find some kind of way to tell you what I've learned from being a bedroom producer for around 6 years now, and just talk about what I've done so far with my music, things I've done right, I think things I've done wrong, things I could do better, and how I've improved so far, and how can I continue to improve. So as of today, June 27th, 2022, I have released 12 solo albums. So I'm going to be ranking my own top 12 albums in some sort of way. I imagine most artists would have their own kind of ranking, their own kind of favorite albums that they've done and least favorite albums that they've done. You can definitely tell because when they go on tour, they never mention these albums, or they never play any songs from these albums because possibly they're not successful enough, or they might not be thought of very fondly by the artists themselves. And I definitely do have stuff like that as well. So there are quite a few elements at play when coming up with this ranking. For example, I'm ranking them in order of how much they appeal to a wider audience, how much do I enjoy listening to them myself, how much do I enjoy making the albums, how good do I think the albums sound right now. So without further ado, let's get on with the show and head on to album number 12. Coming in at number 12 is Stasis from 2021, I believe. It was released just like a few months before the Morgana album. I'm pretty sure a lot of you have heard that one. Some people might not even know that I made an album called Stasis. It consists of 5 tracks, and they're all at least 20 minutes long each, up to 24 minutes I think one is. And yeah, it's an experimental noise album, which most people do not appreciate. And jokingly, I might say that I do not appreciate it either. Just to give you a bit of a backstory, back in 2021, I was quite late to the game in exploring and listening to Everywhere at the End of Time, the 6th album project by The Caretaker. It was a big hit on TikTok and it got millions of views. In case you don't know, it's also an experimental noise kind of project where the music itself is supposed to resemble the deteriorating mental state of someone suffering with dementia. So it starts off like listening to dusty records of a old-timey 1930s, 1940s big jazz band kind of works. And then as the albums further progress, the sound gets more distorted. It starts being more chopped up, and it just devolves into basically static noise at the very end. So I was very much inspired by this sort of thing. Just like Everywhere at the End of Time, Stasis is also an example of plunderphonics. And in case you don't know, plunderphonics is creating an album or creating a musical work using pre-existing recordings. What I've done is I took at least 4 tracks that I was working on for my upcoming album Morgana, and I took what I had so far with them and I slowed them down, pitched them down, added lots of reverb, added lots of these quacky synth effects, and the result is what you hear on the album. There is no new music recorded for this album. It's all reusing stuff that I've made already or I was working on already for a future project. I actually cannot remember the exact tracks that I used except for the 5th track, Stupor, which is using the song Let It Be Me from the Morgana album. If you speed it up by 400% and pitch it up by an octave, I believe you can actually make out the beat of Let It Be Me. The concept of Stasis in my head was exploring space exploration and the space travelers going into deep sleep, and the music or the sounds, you might say, kind of reflects the sort of mental state that someone might go into during this sort of deep sleep. So it is a bit more dreamy. It's got this sort of binaural beats and white noise kind of quality to the music. The reason it comes in at number 12 is because I don't listen to it often. I just basically recorded the whole thing in about 3 days, and it was ready to be distributed via DistroKid. I made music videos for all of the tracks as well, and in case you haven't checked them out, please do. If you're so interested, I'm pretty sure I'm gonna have a link up there somewhere. If you look at my YouTube channel and look at these thumbnails, like what the hell am I looking at? It's so fucking black. Jesus. I really need to up the gamma on those or whatever. It really doesn't look very clear. Basically, the videos themselves are just my character Dirk Simbach up in space in some sort of sleep capsule in some sort of spaceship, just traveling through space, asleep in a state of stasis. Some people might interpret it in different ways, and that's fine. But the reason I'm not too fond of it is that it has nothing really going for it except for just some white noise qualities. Apart from Arrhenius, which has some really interesting effects thrown in there, it kind of makes it sound a bit more creepy, almost like there's some synth screams happening throughout. Finally, the reason it's in last place, because I didn't spend much time on it, and I just did it because I thought I could do it. And there's not really much more to say. It's just a interesting sort of sound project that I wanted to do, I wanted to accomplish, and I thought I did a alright job, I guess. But I definitely did listen through it about 3 times before I got bored of it. So anyway, on to number 11. It's not you. Number 11 Geno Samuel album is Distemper, which is another more experimental kind of sounding project, which I believe might have been my 4th or 5th commercially released album. The concept behind Distemper is that I was trying to make music in more interesting ways, just trying to come up with alternate ways to compose music, like for example creating a song with only using one note, or writing down notes and note values onto pieces of paper and picking them out, and in this order that I pick them out creates the melody of the piece, or turning sounds into images, or images into sounds, into MIDI notes, into a full band performance, stuff like that, or pitch and speed manipulation a la Time Slows Down. So this is another project that I decided to make because I like to experiment just a bit for this single album, but I don't really go back and listen to it all that much these days. It's definitely got some interesting tracks on it. For example, Samsen Vutek Fowakurp, which is sung in my own language, and Time Slows Down, again, is also a pretty decent track. And if you don't time dilate and fuck around with the speed of it, it's actually a pretty complex song that I might actually re-record again and just like play it straight without any time shifting or pitch shifting. So let's move on to number 10. Number 10 is Pythagore, which was released in 2016, and it's my 3rd commercially released album. It's made with the intent of it sounding like as if it were released in 1984. So it was influenced by synth electronic artists of the time, such as Jean-Michel Jarre, a bit of Vangelis, a bit of Tangerine Dream as well. And it's made so that it perfectly fits onto a vinyl record. There's 2 pieces on it, each around 20 minutes. So there's side A of the vinyl and then a side B of the vinyl, Pythagore 1 and 2. Mind you, just looking back on it now, the gap in my fondness between 12, 11 and 10 is quite wide actually. So from 10 to 1 onwards, I think it's a very tight competition, and this ranking is just sort of kind of something arbitrary that I made for this video, and it can switch around several places depending on my mood of the day. But anyway, as you might have noticed, I do like to experiment with different kind of sounds, different kind of soundscapes, and different kind of instrumentations, and this is yet another experiment of mine. But Pythagore is definitely something that ended up sounding a lot like what I had in my head. It's something more drony. There's less of a focus on a melody and more on a sound bed, a soundscape. And again, it's almost like something that you can definitely vibe to and possibly imagine a sort of scene in your head, and it creates a sort of mood in your mind just by the sounds of the instruments. They're all electronic instruments. I used VSTs that pretty closely match up to the kinds of analog and digital synthesizers that were available at that time in around 1994. In around 1984 and before 1984. So yeah, Pythagore, which was only very recently released onto Spotify after a 6-year absence. Please check it out. I think it's a pretty worthwhile project, and if there's enough interest, I'd love to put onto a vinyl record and get it out there physically. So let's get on to number 9. For number 9, we're jumping forward around 4 years to my 2020 album, Stigma. Once more, it's a very crazy deviation from the norm, and I tried to experiment with a more hard rock, heavy metal, prog metal kind of sound for this one. This is actually the second part of my 3-album trilogy, Morgana, Stigma, and Vienna. So the final track of Morgana fades into the first track of Stigma, and likewise the last track of Stigma melts into the first track of And Vienna, so you kind of have to play them in one sitting, ideally. I'm not a huge fan of heavy metal or more heavy rock music in general, but I've definitely had song ideas in my head that I wanted to put on an album. However, making a hard rock song that's like stuck in between two synth pop songs on an album is a bit weird, so whenever I want to experiment with a certain sound, I have to dedicate an entire album to that sound, and Stigma is one of these examples. This is the first and only time I would ever go this heavy. It sounds pretty decent. I'm definitely pleased with the mixing that I did on this one. I definitely screamed a lot in the vocals on this album, something that I really can't readily replicate when I'm singing live, like in a stream on YouTube, for example. It really takes a toll on your voice, and you have to drink lots of hot tea just to recover from that. It's a style of music that I'm definitely not suited for. I listened to some examples of more older heavy metal music, like for example some Judas Priest, some Accept, some Saint Anger by Metallica, stuff like that, just to get some inspiration for the sound. Standout tracks are definitely The Day They Closed the World, Dance with Dave, and Carnal State. Please check it out if you're into more sort of vintage 80s metal kind of music. Maybe you'll enjoy it. Number 8 is Tokyo Computer Music, which I recorded during my year abroad study in Tokyo in 2017. And it's yet another instrumental album, all electronic instruments, and judging by the title alone, it's quite computerized. It's very robotically and inhumanly precise. I quantized the hell out of everything. I was very much inspired by Tanaka Yasutaka, who is the Japanese producer responsible for the sound of Perfume and Kyari Pamyu Pamyu, among other artists. I was releasing lots of emotions for this album. It's just something that I had to get it out there. I was going through some tough times, you might say, in my first year in Tokyo, so I decided that it would be a good way to kind of release them and musically realize them. You get tracks like Alone in Tokyo, Restless Nights, and 8 Hours, So Close as well. They're kind of standout tracks for me. I think comparing mixing and finalizing albums, the more electronic stuff that I make, which I predominantly use VSTs with, like in Pythagore or Tokyo Computer Music, these instrumental electronic albums, for me, they're really easy to mix, because the virtual instruments that I use, they sound great out of the box already, so you don't really need to tinker with the EQs and the effects all that much. And that for me is quite different from mixing the live guitars and the live bass and the live acoustic guitars. They're just a complete bitch to master for me. So albums like Stigma get pushed down a bit, because that one especially was kind of difficult for me to get it to sound as good as I wanted it to. In contrast to Tokyo Computer Music, which was a breeze, relatively speaking. And still for me, looking back like 5 years later, I think it still sounds pretty good, and you should check it out. It's got lots of more dancey tunes, it's kind of a more modern feel. And yeah, let's groove to the grooves. On to number 7. I see you cry. Number 7 is Shadow People, which is the album that I released in 2018 actually, and it's the only album I released that year. Unfortunately, my plans were originally to make 3 albums per year, and I did pretty well in 2016 and 2017. However, in 2018 I started making a certain documentary, which took up a lot of my time. Anyway, Shadow People is an album that is part of a wider 3-part opus. Once more, for some reason I'm quite fond of trilogies, album trilogies. This is the Shadow trilogy here. So Shadow People is the second part, and most of the songs on this one I wrote originally when I was quite a bit younger. I think most of the songs were originally recorded around 2011 and 2012. And by the time this album rolled out, I re-recorded all the songs, or most of the tracks on all these songs, and re-sung it as well to the best of my abilities. There's songs here that are definitely resonate really deeply with me. For example, Recluse, which is also kind of a fan favorite. Syracuse, the closing track, it's more of a prog epic. It's a 12-minute long progressive rock piece that uses a lot of bass work on it. And I originally wrote this back then in like 2011 when I first got my bass, and I wanted to experiment with it and play around with it and make cool, crazy Chris Squire sounds on it. Let Me Be is also a song that's quite close to me, quite dear to me. It's talking about death and unfinished business. Reindeer Alley is a complete reworking of a song called Reindeer Alley, I believe, but the original track was more of a laid-back instrumental kind of piece, but now it's turned into a pretty poppy number. The reason this album is not as high as I would kind of like it to be is that back in 2017 and 2018, when I was mixing these more rocky kind of albums, I discovered that if I go to the EQ of each track and raise the treble quite a bit, to me it sounded more crisp and more high quality, like HD sound was amazing. So what I did is just boost the treble up everything, because I thought, wow, before this it sounded so muffled, and now it sounds so clear. It's great. This is how you make good sounding music, or so I thought back then. And looking back on it now, like even half a year afterwards, I listen back to Shadow People or even Cabbage before it, and it just sounds like just like instrumental sibilance throughout, and no bass at all. So it sounds absolutely fucking shit is the issue. And in the case of Cabbage, I did end up remastering the album. I went to the project files and to the stems and retuned the EQs and all the effects, and I made it sound a bit more balanced and more up to the kind of music that I could do, a few years later. And I haven't done the same thing to Shadow People yet, but I will. I really do intend to. And when the time comes, maybe Shadow People will be boosted up personally, and I think for many other people too. I definitely learned from one of my favorite bands, Marillion, just how important the sound of the music is to the music itself. Like you can have the songwriting chops and you can get the arrangements perfected, but if your recording quality is terrible, then it just ends up sounding really unappealing and people don't want to listen to it. And I think this is definitely the case for Shadow People. I definitely don't want to listen to it that much, even though I am aware that the songs themselves are good. I just need to dig them out of the shithole that they're in and just wipe off the dirt and just re-release it again. And I definitely will do that pretty soon, I believe. So maybe in another 5 or 6 years, I'm gonna redo my rankings again and update the list with all the new albums that I made in the meantime. And maybe this will be pretty high up on the list by then. So in the meantime, Shadow People is available on iTunes and Spotify and YouTube. However, if you go to my Bandcamp and my YouTube playlist, you have the slightly better version where I toned down the treble and boosted the bass a bit. So it sounds a bit better, but still needs a lot of work done. Check it out. Shadow People. Number 6 is June, which is my most recent album release. It's a compilation of 10 cover songs which I've made throughout the years. I think the earliest track might have been in 2015 or so, or 2016. And it's a mix of 5 English songs and 5 Japanese songs. It's not all of the covers that I made, but it's most of them, and I intend to release more cover albums in the future. So this compilation consists of more recent tracks like Jody and Tashikana Koto, and more older stuff like Amakuki Kena Kaori, Dramatic Rain, and Plastic Love. Some people have been asking for Dramatic Rain for years, and it was not available on Spotify or iTunes up until now. Actually, 7 of the tracks were never available for a purchase or for streaming up until now. Plastic Love was available for quite a while, except I retuned the mix a bit and changed the ending quite a bit, and now it's released as a more newer, updated version. And 2 tracks were recorded and really finalized for this album, especially San Jacinto, which is a cover of a Peter Gabriel piece, and Fireflies by Owl City, which also I'm working on a music video because I think the track turned out pretty well, and I want more people to listen to it and to discover it, so I'm going to make a music video for it as well. And the rest of the tracks, I mean 8 of the tracks already had music videos, so everything except San Jacinto and Fireflies. So Fireflies will get a music video fairly soon. It's going to be this year. I'm going to post about it, so please check it out. I went back to the original projects again with this one as well, and I retuned the mix for all of them and re-recorded some pieces as well with more updated synth sounds, and I definitely toned down the autotune for all the tracks because I definitely do rely on autotune a lot. However, when there's no need for autotune, you should not use autotune. That's my motto. At least it is these days. Back then it was just a autotune for the entire track, the same level for the whole thing. However, now I just use autotune when I can't sing well. And you know, if I was actually a more dedicated singer, if I sung a lot more daily, and if I perfected my vocals a bit more, if I cared a bit more about how my vocals sounded, I would use a lot less autotune. But sometimes I do come up with some pretty good notes that are pretty well on key, so I'm going to leave them in because it sounds more natural. And yeah, it's a pretty decent sounding album. They're more commercial sounding tracks. It's nothing too challenging on it, apart from, I guess, San Jacinto. So please check it out. Download and streaming. Links somewhere, maybe over there or there or down there. June, released in June 2022. Next, let's get on to part 5. Part 5? Number 5. Number 5 top Geno Samuel album from Geno Samuel is Octagon by Geno Samuel. This was my second album released commercially, and it's another instrumental piece. I used to do a lot more instrumental albums in the past. The concept behind this album is that it was made to sound like an instrumental electronic analog synth album from 1982, and it was going to be a double vinyl album conceptually. So it's got 4 sides, A, B, C, D, and the track listing accompanies the vinyl time limit, you know, of each side, so like max 20 or 22 minutes per side. Originally, I intended this album to be sounding more abstract and more sound-beddy, relying on arpeggiators and synth washes and beds and waves like that. But it ended up sounding like songs, but without the singing. So the singing is instead replaced with a melody played on a keyboard instrument. So again, just like in Pythagore, which was the third album, I used VSTs of the old-timey instruments that were used back in the day, up to 1982. So I want to keep in with that time frame. Octagon is conceptually also the first part of the Octo trilogy of instrumental albums, instrumental synth albums. Pythagore is not part of it, actually. So Octagon was made to sound like a 1982 album, which will be followed eventually by Octothorpe, which will sound like 1985, and followed by Octopus, which would sound like something from 1989. So the instruments that I use in each of these albums will reflect the time period that they're supposed to represent. And they're probably all going to be double vinyl albums, all instrumental stuff. But it'll be interesting to see just what kind of music I can come up with, you know, being limited to the kind of instruments that would be used at that year. So honestly, the reason Pythagore exists is because the way Octagon turned out was not quite what I had in my head. It sounded more like just a collection of songs that were turned into instrumentals rather than more again, something more like Pythagore, which is not so reliant on a melody or catchy tune. These most of the tracks on Octagon definitely do have almost like a verse chorus structure, just all instrumental instead. Again, as I mentioned before, working with VSTs makes mixing incredibly simple and easy. It sounds really good. It still sounds really good, I think. And I really don't need to retune or rework the EQ all that much. Again, if there's enough interest for it, I definitely do want to release it on vinyl as it was intended. So yeah, this is one of my favorite albums that I've made. It's got a pretty wide range of styles. It's got the more shorter, more poppy tracks, something more similar to maybe Yellow Magic Orchestra, and it got stuff like Octagon, which is the final track, which is the entirety of side D. It's like 20 minutes and 24 seconds long, and that one definitely is more like the kind of music that I intended to make at the beginning of the production of Octagon, but it didn't turn out that way for the most bit. So yeah, please check it out. I kind of do want to boost it a bit more. Recently I made a music video for The Nail off of the Octagon album, and that was quite exploded for some reason. I mean, it wasn't a meteoric explosion, but it got some views, which I didn't expect. And then I made a music video for Speed Junkie, which I also recently released, and that got no traction on it at all, so I really have no idea what's happening. But yeah, please check out Octagon on download and streaming. Next, let's move on to number 4. Number 4 is Shadow Play, which was my first ever album released on download and streaming. My first foray into like the music world, I guess. So Shadow Play is the first part of the Shadow trilogy, followed by Shadow People, and eventually I intend to make Shadow Lands, which will be a double vinyl album, kind of similar in mood to Tales from Topographic Oceans by Yes. There's like 20-minute long pieces, 4 20-minute long pieces. So for Shadow People and Shadow Play especially, I definitely had this idea of combining different styles of music into a single album, which I've since kind of moved away from that concept, and now I devote a single sound or theme to a single album. So Shadow Play has this mix of more shorter poppy numbers. For example, The Turtle, which was a very old song from like 2007 or 2009, I believe, somewhere around there. It was originally an instrumental piece that I reorganized and made into a more proper song. And then Table for One, which is also a pretty decent fan favorite. It's a fun song to play, definitely. It's something that I made during Valentine's Day of 2015 because I was alone and decided to make a song to make myself feel a bit more positive about being alone. And then get more extended, heavy numbers like Chameleon, which is also a bit of a fan favorite because the lyrics are definitely more personal and it's not me coming up with a fake story like so many other songs. And then you got Ice, which is a more low-key, almost ambient kind of sounding thing. And then you got Worlds Apart, which is a more, almost like a hair metal kind of song from the 80s as well. There's lots of 80s tinge happening all over my music, especially on this album. It's just naturally the kind of music that I've always been making, honestly. Ever since I was like 9 or 10 years old, I was making 80s sounding music in the modern day, and it still happens to this day. You can hear the 80s influences all over my place. And then you get the final track, which is a 23-minute long prog rock epic called Taxes. It's about people moving around and being and chasing their dreams and chasing their wants and needs, and comparing them to the way that insects react to stimuli. So it is quite an eclectic mix of songs. It has 8 tracks on it, and it has kind of a tent-pole structure, which was very much influenced by the Marillion album Sounds That Can't Be Made, in the sense that it has a long track at the beginning, a long track in the middle, and a long track in the end, with more accessible pieces in the middle. It's kind of like this shape. Looking back, for some reason this one still sounds pretty good in comparison to something like Shadow People or the original Cabbage. For some reason I'm quite not sure why my first effort sounds as good as it does, honestly, and it actually got worse since then for some reason. I do distinctly remember that after recording all the songs, it took me about half a year to get the mix just right. Probably because I was using Acid Pro 7 at the time on a much weaker computer than I have now, and I was making really complex songs with like 25 tracks going simultaneously, so it just made everything freeze up and work very, very slowly. So I think that was also a reason why it took half a year to get the EQ right. But I don't know, it kind of shows, because it's not that bad. Even to this day, I don't think I really need to touch on it that much. It's an enjoyable listen for me still. The songs still resonate with me pretty well. Very pleased with the way it turned out and the way it still sounds, so please check out Shadow Play from 2016. Good album. at number 3 is my 6th release from 2017, December 2017, Cabbage. This was my first major hit, you might say. I was making these albums just for myself, really. I didn't have an audience. I was just exploring musical concepts, and I had all of these musical ideas that I wanted to get out, and I was just posting them online on YouTube, just for the heck of it, really, just to have something there, just in case anyone was interested in looking, they would find it, really. I didn't really have an audience at that time, just maybe like 100 subscribers on YouTube. But after a certain documentary showed up on a different channel, I shared my music channel on that channel, and I got lots of subscribers in, and at that time, Cabbage was the most recent album, and the most recent tracks and videos and music videos was for that album, so this is why it exploded as much as it did. In addition to the songs being honestly pretty good, I'd say. You got classics like All I Need to Know and My Soft Lithuanian Eyes, and lots of others. It's definitely more accessible music. It was inspired by the synthwave, retrowave craze at the time. It was kind of a craze. It was just a little underground movement of making more 80s sounding music, inspired by the movie Drive and other things as well. This is where I think I really excel at, just making these more electronic music, but also with vocals, so some more 80s sounding stuff. The original mix suffered from the same over trebliness of Shadow People that came after it, and I did make the 2020 remastered version, which definitely sounds a lot better, and I've since removed the original mix from major download and streaming sites. So the newer version of Cabbage is a lot more readily available now, so please check it out. It continues to be ranked as one of my top albums by fans, and it's really something that I was really proud of when I first made it. I felt like, damn, I kind of did something special here. Even though it is quite a long album, it's like an hour and 12 minutes or an hour and 10 minutes with 12 tracks. The last track is 11 minutes. It's like thinking, I have so many ideas about the sound that I can make in this sound, but it's gonna end up sounding very bloated as an album. But I thought these ideas were too good to just keep aside for later. I just wanted to get everything out there, and I did, and it kind of paid off, honestly. So Cabbage 2020 Remaster, a more retrowave, synthwave sounding album. Please check it out. It's one of my top favorites. It'll definitely remain one of my top favorites for me and for others as well. Let's move on to number 2. Number 2 top favorite Geno Samuel album from Geno Samuel is 2019's And Vienna, which is a more acoustic effort. Again, changing the sound one more time. This is the final album in the trilogy, you might say, of Morgana, Stigma, and Vienna. Hence, the And Vienna making sense because it's a list of different titles. It's Morgana, Stigma, and Vienna. See? Though this was actually released before all of them, so I made them in reverse chronological order, but they still kind of interlink with each other. The opposite way, or the right way, which is the opposite way. It's also something that resonated with a lot of people. It's definitely a musical project that very heavily focuses on the melody, and I worked out the melodies really hard. I wanted the songs to be melodic, more classic sounding. I was very much influenced by Carole King and her Tapestry album, and The Band by The Band. So I was going for like a late 60s, early 70s kind of sound, but not so much the actual sound of the 70s, but just the instrumentation and the vibe of that kind of time. And this kind of instrumentation is something that musicians and bands have been using for half a century, honestly. These acoustic guitars and pianos and these raw acoustic drums since the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, the noughties, the 10s. This is kind of like an ageless sound, which I think really helps with the appeal of the album. It doesn't sound so dated like Cabbage, you might say. And I'm also not really trying to emulate a certain sound. It's just making songs that I would like to make, but just limiting myself to a certain instrumentation. So I do believe that limiting yourself to certain instruments and to a certain sound definitely inspires different ideas to come about. Like, for example, writing songs on an acoustic guitar, I can come up with things that I would never come up with playing on on a DX7 electric piano sound, for example. And the songs definitely are melodically strong, chordally strong, and this album also sort of follows my kind of established trait of making shorter songs with a very long song at the end, which is kind of common for my albums, closing with the 15-minute long Travelin'. Falling Behind is actually a very old song of mine as well, which I reworked for this album. As opposed to the Grady EQ balance of something like Shadow People, or the harsh tone of Stigma, or the difficulty in getting into something more experimental like Distemper and Stasis, I believe And Vienna is more pleasant sounding, and hence I believe it is more widely acceptable across many audiences. So I am very fond of And Vienna. That's also one of my partner's favorite things I've ever done. It definitely appeals to her, and definitely appeals to a lot of people who are not so into more difficult stuff. I like to dabble with a prog and these funny sort of synth sounds, but it's all gone here. It's all more raw sounding. I want it to sound like a bunch of people just recording music in some room somewhere, even though it's just me. So there is a rawness to the instrumentation and to the effects. Even there's not that many echoes and delays happening. It's just really raw. More like a true unplugged sound. It's mostly acoustic, though it does have some electronic elements as well. Like, for example, all the pianos and all the electric organs are just VSTs, they're not the real thing, and of course the drums are also VSTs. So the best that I could do with this instrumentation, with my capabilities here in the bedroom. So yeah, And Vienna, available everywhere. Please check it out. One of my favorite pieces. So let's move on to number 1. And I'm pretty sure you know what's coming. Only one left. And that is Morgana. Morgana, which is my most recent original album, released at the tail end of 2021, just around Christmas time. When it was released on Spotify, it fucking exploded, Jesus Christ. It's only been out for about half a year now, but all of the tracks are, popularity-wise, in my top 20 most played. And give it another year, then it's definitely going to be like the top 10 most played tracks on Spotify are just going to be just the Morgana album by itself, with maybe Plastic Love's in there as well. Anyway, Plastic Love really was the catalyst for this album. I made the Plastic Love cover in 2018, December 2018, and that is my most successful song and video. And this is what really inspired me to make an album kind of in this city pop Japanese style. I originally wanted it to be in Japanese with Japanese lyrics and have my partner work on them, but I decided against it to make it more accessible for a wider audience. But it still retains lots of influences from Japanese artists of city pop, for example Yamashita Tatsuro. I'd say it was also pretty heavily influenced by Steely Dan and the funky chords that they would use. When I was finalizing the mix and listening to all these songs again, I just realized, like, wow, this kind of, it's not really accessible. It's not really like Cabot or And Vienna. It's a bit more challenging. The chord structures and the melodies are quite complex, and the arrangement is wacky AF. All the songs are like at least 5 minutes, some are like 6 or 7 minutes. I definitely do create these vibes that I want to keep going. Like, I don't want to just establish this sound and just stop it after a minute or 2 minutes or 3 minutes. I just wanted to keep going and have something to dance to, really. Again, like with And Vienna, the melodies were very important for this album. I was working on some of these songs for 1 or 2 years before I ended up releasing the album. And Stereo Love, for some reason, is like 6.5 minutes long with like 1.5 minute instrumental intro. And that is my most successful original song now, which is really cool. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Just, you can never predict what's going to be the most successful thing, or what's going to work or what's not going to work. But I am hugely indebted to all the additional musicians that were involved with this project. I asked for help both on Fiverr and on YouTube as well, and some people reached out there as well and helped out with the saxophone work and guitar work as well, and trombones and trumpet as well, and it made the album sound more fresh. Having more than one person in your band definitely helps. In addition to all these additional instrumentalist, I also did use lots of synth brass in the arrangements, which added to this more funky city pop sound. Also a bit reminiscent of Steely Dan as well. Got like a brass band in there, and it does add a new flavor to my sound. I don't see myself relying on making like a Morgana Part 2 in the future. It's a one and done kind of album, like with most things that I do, unless it's part of a elaborate trilogy like the Shadow trilogy or the Octo trilogy. I think the mix turned out really great, even though there's lots of acoustic instruments involved, and it was difficult, definitely difficult to get it done, but I think the end result sounds pretty damn good, and I'm very pleased with the way the songs turned out. I'm very happy with the response that it has gotten. I'm very thankful for all of the musicians who contributed. Just overall, the entire production process of Morgana was really, really good and really positive. So this is a huge reason why it's my top album so far, at least. I think it's going to be difficult to top this. Not only is it successful in my heart, but it's successful outside my heart as well. So yeah, this has been my top 12 albums by Geno Samuel. Looking back on my bedroom producer career, every single album that I work on, every single musical project that I work on, I definitely did think at that time that I was the best that I've ever been when I was working on these albums. And then half a year later, I listened back and I realized that these albums sound shit because I was not good enough for these to sound as good as they could be. So as I continue making albums and continue creating music, I learn new things, I explore new editing concepts and mixing concepts, and discover these new effects, presets that make my music sound better. I experiment with a lot of things, and some work, some don't, and I'm always learning, I'm always improving, hopefully. So I think it's helpful to look back on your past works and just analyze yourself and think, where were you back then? And why did you do this way? And could you have done something better? In most cases, you probably could have done better. So I think it's helpful to keep looking back, just to let yourself understand where you came from, how far you've gone, and do you need to keep going? So this 12 album ranking list, it's not necessarily me saying that the music on Stasis is the worst music and the music on Morgana is the best. Worst and best, things like this are completely subjective, especially in music. So you might disagree completely, please do. Please do disagree. If you genuinely do disagree, I'd love to hear your opinions on this and see which albums are your favorites. Because we clearly had very different experiences. You're just the listener, I'm the creator, and I might have some really unpleasant experiences attached to some albums or some musical works that you have no idea about, and you might like them and I might hate them. So it's interesting to hear about these things. I don't hate anything that I made, I'm pretty sure. So that was just a hypothetical thing. Anyway, thanks very much for listening to this ranting, ranking, rambling. If you're interested in my music, I got links for all of it down below. Please check out my Bandcamp, and I'm available as Geno Samuel on both Spotify, iTunes, Amazon, Google, Snapchat, TikTok, anywhere these kids listen to music these days. I'm there, definitely. If you're interested in supporting me some other ways, please check out my Patreon link down below for some updates regarding my music and other projects. If you like what you see and like what you hear, please like and subscribe to Geno Samuel. And thanks again for watching, and hope to see you around someday soon, be it a music video or another one of these talky kind of videos. We'll see. Keep having the music in your hearts alive. Stay strong, stay safe.